The bench sat above the river, like a shelf someone had forgotten to finish, catching every trickle of cold air that slid down from the mesa each night, and pooling there until dawn burned it off. He had known that about the land before he ever broke ground on it, known it the way a mason knows a wall will crack before the crack ever shows. But land was land in the spring of 1881, and a man of 34 with a wife and empty hands could not afford to wait for a kinder claim. She stood at the fence line that morning, with her shawl pulled tight against a wind that still carried winter in it, counting the wagon loads as they came. 3 already this week, tipped and dumped by teamsters from the Glassworks in town, men who did not meet her eyes because the load was an embarrassment to haul and a relief to be rid of. Cracked bottles, warped ones that had slumped in the annealing oven, bottles with necks twisted like a wrung chicken's, all of it glittering now along the fence like a strange broken harvest, catching the weak sun and throwing it back in 100 small directions. Free fill, the Glassworks foreman had told them, not unkindly, when Samuel first asked if he might have the cullet for his footings. The works was failing. Everyone in Trinidad knew it, the way everyone knows a neighbor is dying before the neighbor says the word aloud, and a failing works had no use for its own waste except to be shut of it. Samuel had been a mason's apprentice once, before the war took 4 years and gave back a limp that only bothered him in wet weather. He looked at the glass now the way he used to look at fieldstone, weighing it, turning a warped bottle in his palm, and setting it down again with the small frown of a man doing sums that would not come out even. 90 days. That was what the growing season gave them here on this shelf of frozen air. 90 days between the last killing frost of spring and the first of fall, if they were fortunate, and fortune was not a thing this bench had shown them yet. Their first 2 years on the claim had taught them that lesson hard. Beans blackened in a June frost, squash vines withered before they'd made fruit, a cellar that went into winter thinner than it should. Cora bent now and lifted one of the cracked bottles from the pile, turning it in the early light, and something in the way it sat in her palm, solid, heavy with the sun's warmth already though the morning was cold, made her go still. "Samuel," she said, and something in her voice made him look up from the wagon ruts he'd been studying. "Come look what the frost did to the Hendricks lettuce bed, and come look what didn't die beside it." He set down the piece of fieldstone and followed her across the yard, boots crunching over ground, still stiffened with the night's frost, though the sun was already working to burn it off the higher patches. She led him to the low bed along the south fence, where she'd set out a dozen lettuce starts a week before, coaxed along in the warmest corner she could find, and there they were, collapsed, blackened at the leaf edges, the whole row gone soft and gray the way frost-killed things went, as if the life had simply been drawn out of them in the night. But at the end of the row, where a bottle had tumbled from the wagon load and lodged crown down in the loosened soil, 3 seedlings stood upright and green. She crouched and touched one leaf, then another, half expecting them to crumble at her fingers the way the others had. They didn't. They were tender still, moist, cool but whole, sheltered in the little pocket the fallen bottle had made. Its curved side turned toward the open sky, its neck driven into the earth like a stake, holding a cup of air against the seedlings' backs. "It didn't freeze," she said, mostly to herself. "Everything around it froze, and this didn't." He crouched beside her, turning the bottle over in his hands the way he'd been turning fieldstone all morning, but this time the frown that came to his face was a different kind of frown, the kind that came when a man saw a shape he hadn't been looking for. He held the bottle up to the light, glass thick and greenish, warped along one side where the Glassworks had botched the blow, and he could feel, even now, a faint warmth radiating off the curve of it where the early sun had struck. Held the day's heat through the night. he said slowly. "Just enough to keep the frost off what was under it." "1 bottle," she said. 3 plants. He looked toward the fence line, toward the heap the wagon had dumped. Hundreds of bottles, maybe more, cracked and warped and worthless to anyone in town, glinting dully in the grass like something the earth had spat back up. 90 days. That was all this bench ever gave them, and every year the frost took its share before the harvest could catch up. He'd spent the morning weighing stone, trying to make sums come out even, and here the answer had been sitting in a lettuce bed the whole time, wearing the shape of a broken bottle. "Cora," he said, and she looked up at him, still crouched over the living green of those 3 small plants. "How many bottles do you suppose that wagon left us?" She didn't answer right away. She was looking past him now, toward the Glassworks heap, doing her own kind of sum, and for the first time since they'd broken ground on this claim, her eyes held something other than worry. He crossed to the fence line and pulled 1 bottle free of the pile, turning it in his hands the way he used to turn stone, feeling for the grain of it, the weight, the way light moved through the thick green-brown glass. It was warped near the shoulder, bubbled where the blower's breath had gone wrong, cracked along one seam so that it would never again hold cider or vinegar or anything a body wanted kept dry. But it held its shape. That was the thing his fingers kept telling him. It held its shape, and it held the sun. He thought of the mason's yard he'd apprenticed in. Before the war took 4 years and gave him nothing back but a steady hand and a habit of measuring things twice. He remembered Old Man Pruitt showing him how a thick wall breathed heat back into a room long after the fire had gone to coals, how stone taken warm from noon sun would still be warm at midnight, giving up what it had swallowed, slow and even. Stone did that. Brick did that, if you laid it thick enough. He had never once thought glass might do the same, because glass was for windows, for keeping weather out and light in, nothing more. But a bottle wasn't a window. A bottle was a wall unto itself, closed and hollow things held air, and air held warmth the way a good wool coat held it, not by being solid, but by trapping what was already there. He crouched down beside her, took the fallen bottle from where it lay in the lettuce bed, and turned it neck toward himself, base toward the seedlings, exactly as it had fallen. "It isn't only the glass," he said. "It's the shape of it. Hollow, sealed at one end." He looked toward the heap again, and now he wasn't seeing waste. He was seeing units, each one a small chamber of trapped air, each one capable of catching the day's sun and giving it back slow through the killing hours before dawn. If a single bottle could hold enough warmth to save 3 plants through a hard freeze, then a wall of bottles, laid neck in and mortared fast the way a mason set brick, might hold enough to save a whole bed, might hold enough to push the growing season backward into weeks that had always belonged to frost. "You're thinking like a stonemason again," Cora said, watching his face. "I'm thinking like a man who's tired of losing to 90 days, he said. He set the bottle down gently, base toward the sun, the way it had lain all through the freeze, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the morning settling quiet around them, birds working the fence posts, the heap of broken glass catching light like something waiting to be asked a question. "How much clay have we got by the creek bank?" he said finally, "and how many hands would it take to lay a wall like a chimney, only lying on its side?" They walked the creek bank that same morning, boots sinking in the soft margin where the water had cut low through winter, and found clay enough to answer his question before she'd finished asking it aloud. It came up gray-blue and slick under the spade, the kind of clay that held a thumbprint like memory, and he worked a fistful of it between his palms, until it ribboned out smooth and did not crack. "This'll do," he said. "Needs lime to bind it against frost heave, else it'll crumble come the first freeze-thaw. But it'll do. They had no lime to speak of, only what remained from whitewashing the spring house 2 summers back, so she fetched the crock from the root cellar and he mixed it in by guess and feel, the way he'd watched his master mix mortar years before the war took him away from stone and gave him a rifle instead. The smell of it, sharp, mineral, faintly like the inside of a well, settled over the dooryard while their old mule cropped grass nearby, indifferent to the whole enterprise. They hauled more bottles that afternoon, 2 wagon loads from the Glassworks heap, the wheels groaning under the shifting clink of glass, and sorted them by the fence, whole ones from cracked, cracked from shattered, shattered set aside for gravel fill. Cora's hands found a rhythm in it, quick and sure, the way she sorted seed by size in autumn. Samuel built a small trial wall against the south side of the tool shed, no more than 3 feet long and 2 courses high, working the mortar between each bottle's shoulder the way he'd once set brick to brick, tapping each one gently home with the flat of his palm until it held. "Neck in," he said, more to himself than to her, testing the angle. Let the sun strike the base. Let the neck breathe cold into the mortar instead of the plant bed. By evening the wall stood drying in the last light, a strange, low thing bristling with glass, half finished and already catching color, green, brown, the odd blue shard from a druggist's bottle someone had flung in with the rest. Cora set 3 bean seedlings behind it in a shallow trench of turned soil, more out of stubbornness than certainty, and covered the roots with straw. "If it holds through one more frost," she said, "I'll believe you." "If it holds," he said, "I'll believe it myself." They ate supper on the step that night, watching the wall catch the last orange light and give it back faint and slow even after the sun dropped behind the ridge, a small, stubborn warmth radiating off glass and clay both. The mule shifted in its stall. An owl called somewhere down toward the creek. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that 90 days had beaten better farmers than them, that the bench had a way of humbling ambition down to nothing, but the wall stood there anyway, small and strange and warm, waiting on the next cold night to prove itself. The frost came 3 nights later, thin and silvering, and the wall did exactly what he'd promised. The bean seedlings stood green and unbothered, while the rest of the garden bed lay black and flat, as if some invisible hand had passed over everything but that one sheltered trench. She knelt there a long while in the gray morning, running her fingers along the cold glass, not saying a word, and he watched her from the step, with his coffee going cold in his hand, waiting to see what she'd decide. "We need more," she said finally, standing, brushing frost from her skirt. "Not 3 bottles, hundreds." He sent word into town that same week, riding the mule down to the Glassworks office, where the foreman sat idle at his desk with nothing to foreman over. The man laughed, not unkindly, when he heard what they wanted. Said he'd been paying a boy to haul the cracked stock out to the county dump twice a month, glad enough to save the trouble. Within days the wagons started coming, not the trickle that had built the fence line, but real loads, creaking under the weight of crates and barrels stuffed with rejects, bottles with necks twisted like they'd been wrung, bottles bubbled through with air pockets, bottles the color of weak tea, and others near black with iron. The Glassworks owner himself rode out once to see what they were doing with it all, stood at the edge of the yard scratching his head at the low, glinting wall, and allowed as how he'd never seen scrap put to a stranger use, but he wasn't about to argue with a man willing to haul it off for free. So they began in earnest. He laid out the range with stakes and string, the way he'd once laid foundation lines for houses back east, a long, low course meant to run the length of the garden's best drained ground. She mixed the clay mortar in the washtub, adding sand from the creek bed to keep it from cracking when it dried, and together they set bottles neck in, row on row, tamping each one snug before the next went in beside it. The work was slower than either had imagined. Glass edges caught at their palms even through gloves, and by the second week her knuckles were scabbed, and his fingertips had gone numb in a way that worried her more than she let on. Still they worked from first light until the color drained out of the sky, stopping only to eat standing up, too tired most nights to talk beyond what needed saying about the next course of bottles. The range grew a few feet at a time, homely and glittering, catching whatever light the short spring days offered. Neighbors passing on the road slowed their wagons to stare, some shaking their heads, a few calling out fool questions about whether the bishops meant to drink their way to a harvest. Cora only waved and kept working, and he found himself, more nights than not, smiling at the glass in the dark long after the work was done, watching for that same faint, stubborn glow. By the third week, the range had grown long enough that she could no longer see him at the far end without walking the length of it, and the work had settled into something harder than either had expected when the first bottle went into the clay. Her hands no longer scabbed so much as they simply hurt, a deep ache that ran from fingertip to wrist, and some mornings she had to work her fingers open like a fist, unclenching before she could hold the trowel at all. He did not complain, but she saw him favor his right hand more as the days went on, curling it against his chest when he thought she wasn't looking, and one evening she caught him wringing it out like a wet cloth, trying to shake the numbness loose. "Let me take that side a while," she said, nodding at the course he was setting. "I'm not done in." "Didn't say you were. Said let me take a turn." She held out her hand, and after a moment he gave over the trowel, and they traded places without more words needed, falling into a rhythm of switching off every hour so that neither set of hands bore the whole weight of it too long. It helped some. It didn't stop the cuts. There were nights she cried over the wash basin where he couldn't see, not from the pain alone but from the fear that they were pouring themselves into something that might still fail, that the bench might take their labor and their blood and give back nothing but another hard frost come June. She never said this aloud. Instead, she wrapped her hands in strips of clean cloth each morning before the sun was fully up, and he did the same, and they went back out to the clay and the glass because there was nothing else to be done but finish what they'd started. He took to humming while he worked, tuneless things, hymns half-remembered from before the war, and she found herself listening for it the way she might listen for a bird returning each spring. Proof that something in him was still whole, even as his hands grew rougher and more scarred. When his numbness worried her too much one evening, she took his hand in both of hers by the fire and worked the fingers gently, one at a time, until feeling crept back into them, and he sat very still and let her, watching her face instead of the fire. "We could stop a while," she offered, though she didn't mean it, and he knew she didn't. "Not yet," he said. "Not with the frost still coming for everyone else's garden, and none for ours." She nodded, because he was right, and because somewhere in the ache and the glass dust and the long grinding days, she had begun to believe it too, that the bottles rising row on row along the fence line were not just fill, not just glass, but a wall they were building against every winter yet to come. The morning the last bottle went into the hotbed range, she stood back and counted the rows without meaning to, the way she'd once counted rows of corn, 12 across, 40 deep, each green-brown neck catching the light and throwing it back soft as candle glow. He came to stand beside her, wiping clay from his hands onto his trousers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there was nothing simple enough to say. The range would hold the early lettuce and the onion sets, the things that could bear a little chill so long as the ground beneath them stayed warm past midnight. But he had been turning something bigger over in his mind for weeks, ever since the fallen bottle had done its small miracle over one row of seedlings, and now he laid it out for her by the fire, drawing lines in the ash with a stick. "A house," he said, "not a cabin, a forcing house, low to the ground, walls no taller than a man's waist, built the same way as the range but glassed clean across the top so the sun could reach every inch of soil inside. And beneath it, dug down where no one would think to look, a trench packed with fresh manure, layered and turned, left to work its own slow heat, the way a compost pile warmed itself in autumn. The rot would breed warmth, he said, real warmth, steady through the coldest nights, rising up through the soil to keep the roots from ever knowing there was a frost at all. She listened with her chin on her knees and thought of every root cellar she'd ever packed with straw, every stove she'd banked low to hold heat till morning, and understood that he was only doing the same thing on a grander scale, coaxing warmth from what most folks threw away or buried and forgot. They broke ground for it the next day, digging the trench first, 3 feet down and the length of the house to be, and hauling manure from the Petersons' barn in trade for a morning's worth of Samuel's mason work on their chimney. The smell was fierce enough to bring tears, but Cora only tied a cloth over her nose and kept shoveling, and by dusk the trench was packed and layered with straw between each foot of manure, ready to breathe its slow heat upward once the walls rose above it. Those walls went up faster than the range had, because their hands had learned the rhythm of it by now, clay, bottle, and because some nights Samuel worked past dark by lantern light, humming low, while she held bottles steady for him one after another until her arms shook. When they set the last glass pane across the roof frame and stepped back to look, the whole structure caught the sunset like a held breath, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the first hard freeze of the year. They gave the forcing house 3 days to settle before they trusted it with anything worth losing. 3 days of watching the trench breathe its heat upward, of pressing bare palms flat against the inside of the clay to feel whether the warmth held past midnight, of standing in the doorway at 4 in the morning with a lantern raised, checking the thermometer he'd borrowed from the mercantile against a promise of eggs. On the 4th morning she carried in the seed flats herself. Lettuce first, tucked along the north wall where the glass caught the earliest light. Then cucumbers in hills near the trench's warmest stretch, their thick seeds pressed into soil that felt, even through her gloves, unnaturally alive. Last came the tomatoes, the boldest gamble of all, a crop no one on the bench had ever coaxed past the middle of May, let alone the raw edge of spring. He watched her work and said nothing about the risk, though she knew he carried the same worry she did, folded down small so it wouldn't show. 90 days was cruel enough without pretending a wall of scavenged glass and a trench of rotting manure could outwit it. That night they returned after supper, and the night after that, and the one after that, until checking the forcing house became as ordinary as checking the stock. She would kneel between the rows with a candle shielded by her cupped hand, studying each leaf for the telltale curl of cold damage, while he pressed his palm to the trench wall and read its heat like a man reading weather in his own knuckles. The seedlings did not merely survive. They leaned toward the glass as if reaching for something they recognized. By the 2nd week, the lettuce had gone from pale threads to sturdy rosettes, and the cucumber vines had begun their slow, searching crawl along the strings he'd hung for them. The tomatoes, still modest, had put out their first true leaves, dark green and faintly fuzzed, trembling slightly whenever the door opened to the outside air. Still, worry rode alongside every small triumph. A warm afternoon might bake the house past bearing if they forgot to prop the door, A cold snap might slip in through some seam they hadn't thought to seal. They took turns waking in the night, boots pulled on over bare feet, crossing the dark yard to press a hand to the glass and listen, as though the structure itself might tell them, if only they learned its language quickly enough. One evening, kneeling together over the cucumber hills, her sleeve brushing his, she said what neither of them had said aloud yet, that if this held, if the tomatoes came in even 3 weeks ahead of every other garden on the bench, they would have something no killing frost could touch. He didn't answer right away. He only reached out and steadied a cucumber vine climbing crooked toward the glass, guiding it gently back onto its string, the way a man might guide something new and unproven toward the light it was reaching for. The change came on the 9th of June, riding in on a wind that had no business blowing so cold so late in the season. He noticed it first, stepping out to the well before dawn and finding the bucket chain stiff with rime, the yard grass crunching white and hard beneath his boots. He stood a moment, feeling the air bite through his shirt, then went back inside and shook her awake without a word, because she read it in his face before he spoke it. They dressed fast and went out together into a night gone strange and dangerous, the sky above the bench scoured clear and merciless, every star sharp as a point of glass. The cold poured down the slope from the ridges the way it always did on this bench, pooling in the low ground, finding every hollow. Only tonight it did not stop at the ordinary chill. It kept coming, deeper and harder, until their breath hung in clouds, and the manure trench beneath the forcing house seemed to fight it like a small, stubborn animal refusing to be smothered. They banked it higher, forking in fresh straw and manure by lantern light, their hands clumsy with cold, and then they simply waited, because there was nothing else to do but wait and watch the glass for any sign of frost creeping up from the corners. Somewhere out past their fence, across the bench and down toward the river, other gardens were dying in the dark. They did not know it yet, not with certainty, but they could feel it in the stillness, in the way no dog barked and no rooster called before its time, as though every living thing on the land had gone quiet out of respect for what the cold was doing. Inside the glass, the tomatoes trembled but held. She pressed her palm flat against the pane, feeling for the telltale draw of cold through some seam they hadn't sealed tight enough, and found only the faint, steady warmth breathing up from the trench below. He crouched at the far wall, checking the mortar joints one by one with a lantern, his shadow huge and slow-moving across the bottle glass, searching for weakness the way he once searched a chimney for a crack that might let smoke, or cold, find its way in where it didn't belong. Neither of them spoke of the rest of the valley. There would be time enough for that news when the sun rose and the wagons started coming up from town with word of what the night had taken. For now there was only the trench's low heat, the glass holding steady under their hands, and the small green lives inside it, still reaching stubbornly toward whatever light the morning would bring. Dawn came gray first, then pale gold, spilling slow across the bench like water finding the low places. She stepped outside before the light had fully settled and stood a moment, letting her eyes adjust to what the night had left behind. The mesa garden patches, the ones she could see from the rise behind the barn, were black, not wilted, not drooping the way frost sometimes left a plant to die slow over a day. Black, collapsed, done in a single stroke. The bean rows that had been climbing their poles just yesterday hung like scorched string, someone's early corn, planted too hopeful, too soon, lay flat and darkened in its furrows. She walked the fence line toward the river bottom and saw the same story repeated field after field, garden after garden, all the way down to where the water caught the morning light. Cabbage starts turned to black rags, Squash Hills sunk in on themselves. Even the hardy things, the things folks trusted to shrug off a late chill, had gone the color of an old bruise. He came up behind her, quiet, and together they looked out over what the frost had done to a whole valley's hope for the season. Then they turned back toward the glass. Inside the forcing house, the tomatoes stood upright and green, their small yellow blossoms untouched, trembling only with the breeze that came through the door when she opened it. The cucumbers along the far wall had put out new tendrils overnight, reaching for the twine he'd strung for them. The lettuce beds, tucked closest to the trench where the heat rose steadiest, looked fuller than they had 2 days before, as though the cold outside had somehow pressed all that stubborn life inward and made it thrive. She knelt and touched a tomato leaf, half expecting it to crumble the way everything beyond the glass had crumbled. It didn't. It was cool and firm and alive under her fingers. Dew still beaded along its edges, catching the early light like something holy. "They don't know," she said softly. "They don't know what happened out there." He stood in the doorway, looking out at the blackened valley, then back at the green rose behind her, and said nothing for a long moment. There was a kind of weight in it neither of them had words ready for. Not triumph, not yet, but something close to it, tangled up with the plain, hard knowledge of what their neighbors had lost overnight. Somewhere down toward the river road, a wagon wheel creaked, moving slow, and they both knew before it came into view that it would be carrying news and questions, and before long, need. The wagon belonged to the hotel keeper, and he did not so much arrive as stumble down from the seat, hat in hand, staring past them at the glinting rows behind the glass walls, like a man seeing water in a desert he'd already given up crossing. He didn't ask how, he only asked how much and how soon, because his own kitchen garden was black stubble and his guests still expected supper. By noon, 2 more wagons had come, one from the mining camp foreman who'd walked half a day on the strength of a rumor, and one from the school teacher, thin-faced and anxious, wanting to know if there might be enough greens to put something green on 40 children's plates come Monday. She found herself doing sums in the dirt with a stick, bushels against mouths, mouths against days, while he cut lettuce with the same steady hands that had once mortared bottle to clay, neck by aching neck, through a spring neither of them would forget. They gave freely what they could that first day, and took payment only where it was offered without asking, and by evening the news had traveled the length of the valley the way bad news usually did, only this time it was good, strange, unbelievable news. The frost had taken everything but the bishop's garden, and the bishop's garden was somehow whole. It was near dusk, the two of them bone-tired and grateful for it, when the Glassworks owner came walking up the lane alone, no wagon behind him, hat in his hands the way the hotel keepers had been. He looked older than he had in winter, worn thin by failure the way rope wears thin under weight. He said what everyone in town already half suspected, that the works were closing for good, the last of the good glass sold off, the furnace to go cold within the week. He said it plainly, without much bitterness left in him, as though he'd already grieved it privately and had only this last errand to finish. What he had left, he said, was the yard. Years of cullet and cracked ware, bottles gone soft-shouldered or bubbled in the batch, more glass than any man could want or use, except, it seemed, for 2 people who'd found a use for what everyone else called ruin. He'd sell it all, he said, the whole heap of it, for whatever they thought fair, because better it went to make something grow than sit rusting the ground where it lay. She looked at Samuel, and Samuel looked back at her, and neither of them needed long to answer. Cora named a price before she could think better of her own boldness, and it was a fair one, not charity dressed as trade. Enough that the Glassworks man could close his ledgers with his head up, not enough to strip a household that had spent its whole hard spring proving what glass could do. He shook on it right there in the lane, and something in his shoulders came unbent, as though the weight he'd carried all winter had finally been handed to someone strong enough to take it. Word ran through town faster than she could walk to spread it herself. By week's end, she'd hired 3 of the idle blowers, men who'd spent their working lives shaping glass at a furnace's mouth and never once imagined they'd end up sorting cullet in a farmyard, separating the sound pieces from the ruined, scrubbing soot and old wax from bottle mouths with rags and creek water. They worked with the same care they'd once given fine ware, because it turned out a man's hands don't forget what it means to handle glass with respect, whatever shape the glass has come to. The yard behind the house filled with crates of sorted bottles, green and amber and clear, waiting their turn to be laid neck-in along new courses of clay. Samuel walked the rows most evenings before supper, measuring with his eye where the next hotbed would rise, where the wall might bend to catch another hour of morning sun. Cora kept the accounts on the back of an old seed catalog, tallying what the hotel owed, what the mining camps had paid, what the schoolhouse children carried home in their pockets, cucumbers wrapped in handkerchiefs, tomatoes still warm from the glass. Come dusk, with the blowers gone home and the tools put away, they'd stand together at the fence line where it had all started, in that first low light when the bottlenecks caught the sun going down and held it, glowing dull gold and green and clear along every wall they'd built. The town depended on them now in a plain, unhidden way, depended on 2 people who'd looked at a fence heaped with cast-off glass and seen not ruin but shelter. Neither of them said much, standing there. There wasn't much that needed saying. She reached for his hand, scraped and calloused as her own, and he took it the way he had every evening since the first frost-killed seedling had shown them what a broken bottle could still do. Behind them, the forcing house glinted, warm within, green within, alive within, a whole season's proof that what shatters need not be wasted, only gathered and set again toward